Good morning.
Good morning.
It is a great joy to be here with you again, I bring you greetings from across the Episcopal Church, from Episcopalians in Taiwan, in Micronesia, Honduras, Ecuador, Colombia, Venezuela, Curacao, Haiti, which is our largest diocese, the Dominican Republic, the British and U.S. Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, Austria, Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, Switzerland, and the rest of the United States. They pray for you. I would ask your prayers for all of them. It's hard for me to believe that it's been 6 years since we gathered at St. Michael and All Angels. Your journey has been a long one. And in addition to grief and I think some despair at the beginning, that journey has brought growth and maturation and a deepened sense of interconnection with this community, the larger church, and the world. Thank you for demonstrating what it is to be disciples and missionaries, that it means getting out there on the road as friends of Jesus, who, as wisdom puts it, know that the righteous are kind and filled with hope. Hope underlies Jesus' story about weeds in the wheat field. No, he says, you can't run out there and start pulling the weeds before harvest time, because you're likely to pull up some of the wheat as well. The kind of weeds he's talking about look a whole lot like wheat. So the farmer is stuck with the reality that if you're going to harvest everything there is to harvest, you have to wait. It won't increase your yield to try to weed the field before everything is ripe. A friend and a former staff member came to see me this last week. Now he is working with reentry programs for parolees, particularly focused on young men under the age of 25. New York State releases something like 2,500 prisoners every month, and about a quarter of them are youth and young adults between 16 and 25. The brains of kids that age aren't fully developed yet, but in too many places we lock them up for minor crimes and sometimes for more serious ones. We also lock up a whole lot of mentally ill folks rather than providing effective treatment. That's an awful lot of wheat being confused with weeds. Religious institutions often react in the same way, and Christ Church certainly knows something about that. There's a strain in human behavior that wants to be absolutely clear about who's in and who's out. And usually we only want to let in people who agree with us. Too often we try to exclude people who make us uncomfortable or fearful, enemies, opponents, those people, anybody who doesn't fit our idea of a proper human being. Jesus sits down to dinner with all sorts of others, public sinners, enemies of the state, social reprobates. They're all welcome at his table because he sees wheat, not weed. He sees beloved child of God, somebody who reflects divine creativity. He sees a potential friend. He has hope for continued growth. And that growth sometimes comes in surprising ways, as many of you learned in exile. What does it take to hope that a person might be more than what we see at first encounter? or even before we meet someone as an individual? What does it take to expect that God is still at work in another? That more is possible than we might believe? Do we expect that God is at work in us, expanding our vision and our capacity for discernment? That hope and expectation is what prayer is most fundamentally about. Prayer starts in that yearning to recognize and experience the divine more for ourselves, for our friends and family. Loving God with all our whole heart and mind and soul and strength can expand that prayer to include our enemies and even the difficult people around us. Pray that God will do more than we can ask or imagine in us and in our neighbors. We need that kind of prayer in abundance for the divisiveness in Congress, for the stalemate in Israel and Gaza that is killing and terrifying so many, for the bitterness that remains in some who left this church and some who remained, and for the strand in each one of us that simply doesn't want to engage somebody who has hurt or threatened us. God's actually been working that kind of hope-filled newness around here for a long time. Christ Church was the site of the baptism of the first black person in Savannah in 1750. Someone saw wheat in her, and the priest in this place concurred. There's still work to do, for not all the residents of Savannah are greeted and encouraged as joyfully as we are meeting one another here this morning. One of your ancestors in this place, Juliet Gordon Lowe, saw wheat everywhere she looked, in rafts of little girls and not so little ones, at a time when women and girls were rarely accorded equal access to anything. There are signs of expansiveness on that score as well. Even the Church of England is moving into a new place. The ability to suspend judgment and to wait for the ultimate harvest can be cultivated. It might even look like turning the soil in our own hearts, uncovering what is fertile and breaking up the manure so it can do its job, instead of plucking up still growing plants. That kind of garden tending certainly has something to do with keeping the field well watered and life-giving showers of grace and roots that reach down deep into the fount of life. There's something about this parable that evokes very current ecological sensibilities. It's really insisting that the health of one part of the garden, one part of the system, depends on the health of all the others. If you pluck out the part that you don't like or don't want, the rest is going to suffer. The developed world is beginning to learn that our profligate use of antibiotics is making a lot of us sick and overweight because we're killing off the good bacteria as well as the dangerous ones. Those good bugs keep us healthy. They make vitamins for us. They help us digest our food. The weedy bacteria become more dangerous when they're not balanced by others. An emerging movement called One Health has begun to respond to diseases that have moved from their usual hosts in bats and pigs and primates into human beings, things like HIV and Ebola and influenza. Human beings haven't got much resistance because we didn't evolve with those microbes. They have, in some sense, been plucked out of their usual field and planted in new and unfamiliar ones. The realization that the health of the whole community depends on the health of each part, growing in its own way and in its own context, isn't just a scientific revelation. It's an ancient teaching in our own faith tradition. Human flourishing depends on the other creatures. The plants and animals who provide our food and clothing and shelter, who recycle our waste and clean the water we drink. We are increasingly being challenged to understand that how we judge the other parts of our environment affects our ability to live and to do so abundantly. Is this weed or wheat? Useful or waste? Resource or dumping ground? Loving God and discovering the reign of God among us has something to do with loving our neighbors, both human and non-human creatures, both those we recognize as human and the ones we have doubts about, both those we see as holy and those we are sure are not. The very current tragedies around us, the Christians and Yazidis and Muslim minorities who are being pushed out of Iraq, the move to reject child refugees from Central America, the war between Abraham's children in the Middle East, those are all attempts to weed the garden. It makes God weep. It makes God heartsick. Creation is an intricate web of life, more complex and awesome, finely balanced and exquisitely beautiful than any human being can possibly envision. So is the human community. The dream of God, the heaven on earth we pray for so earnestly, needs all those parts working together to build up the whole. Who are we to decide who is fit for that dream and who is not? Let them and us grow some more. It's not time for the harvest yet. Give us hearts and eyes to discover God's beauty in those we ignore or despise. Our salvation, our healing and wholeness is bound up with theirs. Tend the seeds of your own heart. Water them with tears of lament and showers of grace. Cultivate an interest in a person or a group who seems like a weed. This community of faith can teach the world about that kind of good gardening. We have tasted the bread of life. Help the world hope for bread and not weeds.
As we have said before to Bishop Katharine, we very much appreciate the encouragement and support of you and your staff. We appreciated it when we were in the desert, and we appreciate it even more that now we're full of joy here at Christ Church. And as we said the other day, you and your staff have been a real treasure to Christ Church. So we decided we would share with the presiding bishop a treasure of Christ churches. Our community, our church community, has always had a very strong leadership position in our community, especially women. And that continues to this day, I can promise you. In 1955, 6 women were concerned about what was happening in downtown Savannah and formed Historic Savannah Foundation. Of those 6 women, 4 were members of Christ Church. And one of the real leaders was a woman named Anna Colquitt Hunter, who was a very well-known artist and loved this church. She was a primitive artist, or I think as the Telfair says now, a faux naive artist. She had a simple but yet very sophisticated style, and she painted for our church a wonderful painting. It's called Flowering of the Cross, and it was the children of Christ Church presenting flowers at the front altar of this church. It hangs in our undercroft. This is the only copy of that painting, and we're delighted to give it to you and your staff. Every time you look at it, you'll realize you're a treasure to Christ Church.